Hi, this is David Shoemaker, and I'd like to welcome you to Living Thelema. Now, this month we're going to talk about the chakras and the great work. Like a lot of topics we've covered and a lot of topics in esotericism in general, there are lots of different ways these terms are used. There are lots of different ways of thinking about the chakra system in the context of personal transformation. So I recognize going in that we're going to oversimplify, we're going to have to limit ourselves to a certain vantage point in order to get anything accomplished here today. So with that caveat, let's dig in. One of the things I want to make clear from the outset about today is that I'm going to be talking about the chakra system more in terms of the stages of personal transformation than as discrete energy centers in the body per se. I think that's one of the breakdowns that you see in the way this is talked about. It's often thought of and focused on in terms of these energy centers in the body or subtle centers in the body. And sometimes I think we miss out on the larger significance of the transformative model that we're working with here. So don't get hung up as I'm talking today. Don't get hung up on the attribution to specific body centers as much. This will be useful at times to work the system, but I think all too often what it does is it makes us overly concretize the symbols of transformation that we're really working with. I'm going to be using Sephirothic attributions, loosely based on those given in Crowley's 777, column 118, with some of my own adaptations. Also, I'm going to be drawing a lot today on the work of Joseph Campbell, who's spoken and written lucidly on the chakra system over the years. The stages of transformation that I'm going to talk about today certainly apply in their fullness to the unfolding of the great work in the system of AA, from probationer to abscissimus, if you want to think of it in the grand scale. And I am going to be talking about the attributions of the chakras to a specific Sephiroth. But when I say that a chakra is related to a particular Sephira, I'm not implying that an awakening in this chakra is synonymous with the attainment of the corresponding AA grade. That would be a much more complex, fully realized, and individualized process. What I'm talking about here is the degree to which, in a given moment of consciousness, all the light bulbs in the psyche are illuminated, and we have these glimpses of higher consciousness. It's like the circuit is complete up to a certain point in a given moment of our individualized consciousness, and that moment is what I'm describing here, or those periods of time when we have expanded awareness. We don't generally stay in that state for very long. As we move along in the path of return, we manage to stay in these states longer and longer. That's part of the goal. But more often, and certainly more commonly in the early stages of the work, we end up dropping down into operation from, in essence, the lower chakras as we deal with the ins and outs of daily life. For example, there's never been an adept in the world who hasn't sometimes been basically just living from a reactive place, in response to some sort of daily stressor. That's just the human body doing its thing and impinging on our consciousness. So that's going to happen no matter where you've been on the mountain. Now, as many of you know, in the OTO system of initiation, there are certain attributions of the degrees to the chakras. And for obvious reasons, I'm not going to discuss the symbolism of OTO degrees here, but OTO initiates who are listening may wish to review the diagram in Equinox 3, Volume 3, Number 10, which gives the correspondences between the chakras and the degrees of the Man of Earth triad, and you might want to think about those correspondences as another overlay as I'm discussing things here today. So let's begin. We begin, of course, at the base with Muladhara, the term meaning root base. This is Malkuth. The psyche is inert, essentially. The basic nature of this consciousness is of a binding force, the binding force of matter and of the illusion of purely material existence. The obstacles for growth here are a desire for physical security, a clinging to the illusion of physical security, meaning our safety in a deeper sense. We're guided primarily by fear responses. This is the animalistic and sort of reptilian brain. Nefeshic obsessions, simple survival. To transcend this, we have to disidentify with survival impulse as the primary center of our focus. Now, you might think about this in context of the AA neophyte's task, also to master control of the body of light. In doing that task, and that task corresponds to the path of Tav specifically for the neophyte, mastering the body of light is, in essence, expanding our consciousness so that we transcend the limiting belief that we are our physical bodies. So you can see how this relates to the ordeal of the Muladhara, which is that absorption in matter. Joseph Campbell gives a really interesting and compelling image here out of the various mythologies relating to dragons. As you know, many times in dragon stories, the dragon is guarding a horde of some kind, and typically this involves one or more of the following: a virgin, a woman, or a hoard of gold, a treasure of some kind. And Campbell points out that these you can think of as corresponding, the virgin corresponding to Yesod, the sexual life, the vitality, the divine force within us, and the gold to Anahata, the Tifereth center, the gold of awakened spiritual selfhood. And what a compelling image that this dragon, symbolizing absorption in matter and clinging to stuff, is preventing us from accessing the regenerative power of Yesod and the light-giving adepthood of Tifereth. So it was a fun image. I thought I'd mention that here. So moving on, we have the Svadhisthana chakra. This translates roughly as her favorite resort or her favorite standing place. This we're attributing to Yesod. The functioning here, the consciousness here, is still primarily self-serving. Just as survival physically is self-serving, here, instead of simply being concerned with survival of a single organism, there's some concern with perpetuation of the genes. Of course, at the animal level of awareness, we're pretty oblivious to the will of our DNA to survive and perpetuate itself. As human animals in this unawakened state, we're mostly just aware of wanting sex for pleasure or wanting to produce offspring to ensure family survival or fulfill societal or identity expectations and so on. These are still self-serving goals, in a sense. Obstacles here include the obsession with sex, potentially. This is sort of the origin of a lot of Freud's theory. That is, his work, I think, was exploring this level of consciousness where we get bound up in libido stuckness. And to transcend it, we have to allow the sex force to seek its higher aim, the transformation of the higher centers, via the unclenching of the self-serving perpetuation via reproduction. In other words, we have to perceive that the real aim of this force within us, this regenerative power, is divine. This is our first glimpse of the divine in life, that there is this power within us that we don't yet recognize as within us necessarily, but it's our first encounter with divinity in some form. Now, in the AA, Correspondingly, we have the Zealoter, who's the grade attributed to Yesod, working to intensify the awareness and flow of this sex force, life force, via the beginning practices of pranayama. Now we move on to the third chakra, which is Manipura, translated as City of Jewels. I'm going to attribute this to Hod and Netzach together. Now, a moment ago we were talking about Svadhisthana as being reflective of that stage of consciousness, or that stage of neurosis, really, in humans, that Freud explored as the will towards sex. But here we have something akin to the Adlerian will to power. Alfred Adler, of course, was another psychological theorist who talked about the power drive being the core. Jung found truth in both Freud and Adler's work and said, we're driven toward will, we're driven toward power, we're driven toward death. These are all valid drives. But here in Manipura, the particular focus is still self-serving, but the focus is personal power within a social context. So it's slightly less purely self-focused in that it takes into account at least the existence of a community, but the aim is still personal power, dominance over the herd, being the alpha male in the pack of whatever animal. Campbell calls this the yoga of war in some senses, that when it's taken into its right place, as I'll describe later, as it impinges on the Vishuddhi chakra. Now, I attributed this to Hod and Netzach, and I should note that, of course, the path connecting these is the tower, the path of Pe, where we go to war with our own limiting conceptions, our own outworn forms of consciousness that need to be destroyed in order to be rebuilt into something more functional and healthier. So to transcend this, essentially what we're doing is finding a way to be centered in our own power without the need to control or dominate others, to get past the illusion of others being separate entities that we need to control or dominate in order to survive. In other words, we move upward towards anahata as a general trajectory here. Now, I'm going to pause here to note that the three chakras we've discussed so far, the Muladhara, Svadhisthana, and Manipura, are essentially all describing in their primal form animal consciousness. Up to this point, a person who is predominantly living out of these stages of awareness is barely exceeding the functions of an animal. What happens from here helps us to become fully human and fully superhuman. Now, the next chakra after this is anahata. Now, this literally means not hit. The sound of two things not hitting each other. Now, how can there be a sound of two things not hitting? Well, if there are not two things, if there is only one thing, oneness, the realization of the unity of human experience and consciousness, agape. Anahata represents that awakened consciousness of the spiritual interconnectedness of all beings. Yet, this is still experienced in relationship to another. This is the namaste idea, where you greet another, recognizing the common divinity in the other person, yet that divinity is experienced relationally. You're not at one with it. You're not yet to the place where the full consciousness is of no distinction. Now, the word of the Anahata chakra traditionally is A-U-M, Om. And this is, the symbolism here is that all other words are merely fragments of this one great word, just as all manifest forms are but fragments of the one, the unity. And this is symbolically the essence of that agape consciousness that I was describing. Now, in the system of AA, of course, the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel at Tefereth brings us into awareness of our relationship to the Holy Guardian Angel, the relationship of which we could not have been fully conscious until the knowledge and conversation is accomplished. But even the adept of Tefereth is not fully conscious of union with the Holy Guardian Angel. This takes much additional work, the work of the other Sephiroth attributed to Anahata and my scheme today, Chesed and Geburah, as well as the Supernal Triad. But the adept of Tefereth has nonetheless entered into this real conscious relationship with the beloved, with the angel, is face-to-face with the angel, is in a courtship, a marriage even, with the angel, yet it is still a self and other relationship. But this is certainly a breakthrough of consciousness beyond the animal levels I was describing below. Now, the next chakra moving up is Vishuddhi, which basically means purgation. This is essentially a purging of the Ruach obsessions, which is essential for the supernal consciousness, for the crossing of the abyss, the opening to transcendence of human life and human consciousness. Now, when the Vishuddhi chakra is closed, we might attribute this to Da'at, the limitations of human consciousness, the false knowledge. We are still entrapped somewhat by being bound up in ego awareness as opposed to transcendent awareness. And when Vishuddhi is opened, we've completed the crossing of the abyss and attained to Binah. So you can see Vishuddhi as kind of having a dual nature there. Something very interesting is happening here with the energy of Manipura. Now, the energy of Manipura, as you remember, has previously been essentially facing outward into the world, using that energy to conquer and gain power over others. But now, rightly understood and rightly applied, this energy, this conquering energy, this yoga of war, is turned inward and brought to bear on the transformation of the self. This is the inner war. That traditionally, this is the process sometimes called the turning about of the Shakti. We move from the erroneous conception that our destructive force should be turned to others for our own power purposes, and arrive at the enlightened awareness that the war to be fought is against our own limiting conceptions of self. And this represents full attainment of the Vishuddhi energy. The next chakra is Ajna, which means command or summoning, and we're going to attribute this to Hokmah. Campbell says this is like seeing God, but with a sheet of glass, a pane of glass in between us and God. So the soul finally is fully face-to-face with its object. The lover and the beloved are face-to-face, but are not yet one, not experienced yet as one. We, in this vantage point, are uniquely positioned to experience all the ego we have built, developed, and lived in, yet we can also glimpse the beyond. We, in this threshold state, have one foot in Ruach consciousness and the other fully in the divine consciousness. 1 foot in unity and 1 foot in dualistic consciousness. As Hokmah, the grade of the Magus in the AA system, we have that Magus consciousness here of that one word, the one formula, which is our unique link to the universal will. But we're still one step removed from immersion in that, from complete identity with the oneness that we are. So, even to have a word, to have a logos that you deliver to the world, you still have to posit a separation between the thing delivering the word and the thing that receives it. So this is still not quite the level of unity symbolized by Sahasrara, which is our next chakra, of course. One more thing to note here for Ajna, though, is that just as before the force of Manipura was elevated to impinge on Vashuddhi, so that inner war takes the place of the outer war, here the force of Svadhisthana, the sexual love and the awareness of the life force expressed outwardly as sex, is inwardly directed as a devotion to the divine. So here again we've elevated an aspect of one of those animalistic chakras and applied it toward one of the higher chakras. The force of love itself, not directed merely to sexual union, but to love of the divine. The crown chakra, Sahasrara, means thousand-petaled. And here, as I've said several times, we arrive at a complete union with the beloved, the angel, the all, God, Nuit. Fill in the blank with your favorite term. There is no separation. This is the Kether point. Here we are released from the bondage of matter. The corpse of Malkuth is rightly seen as the deathlessness of the pure spirit. What we perceived as death is actually deathlessness. Kether is in Malkuth. Interestingly, some depictions of the Sahasrara chakra feature the bodies of Shava, which is corpse, back to back with Shiva, which is, of course, the deities. So this polarity and two-sidedness of death and immortality are embodied here in interesting ways. The 9th century Sufi master, Mansur al-Hallaj, has a story which some of you may have heard, which beautifully illustrates the nature of this transition from Ajna to Sahasrara, to go from that seeing God through a pane of glass to being God. And the story basically is there's a moth who is longing after a flame, and every night flies towards this flame in a lantern behind a pane of glass. The lantern is constructed such that the fire is within the pane of glass, and so the moth over and over again is pounding against this glass in ecstasy and seeing God right there, seeing its goal right there, until one day when the lantern happens to be open and the moth is able to fly into the flame, be annihilated in the flame, and in that moment of annihilation, and from our human perspective, from our earthbound perspective, in the moment of its death, it actually achieves its eternal goal of unity with the flame. It is the flame. It is God. And you can see how radically different that is from simply seeing God face to face through the glass. So, be the moth in your own way, I suppose. Now, I want to close with mentioning that after the attainment of Sahasrara, there is a doctrine that the initiate returns to Anahata, returns to abide in love in that place where we perceive the divinity in relationship to the world, partaking of both the divine and the human consciousness simultaneously. Now, I think this is really interesting. If you compare this to stories of the hero's journey, where the hero has gone out to slay the dragon, we've talked about the dragon today already, and obtained the reward, the boon. The hero doesn't just wander off with the gold and the girl and settle down somewhere to enjoy it purely him or herself. The hero comes back to society and shares that boon. The path of the great work is characterized by this service to humanity. Crowley talks about this in comparable terms when he describes, in terms of the AA system, that the Magister crosses the abyss, attains to supernal consciousness, and then is cast out into the sphere of his or her work in the world, the sphere best suited to his or her work in the world. And I think we have a direct parallel here. The path of individual attainment is ultimately the same as the path of service to all. What appears initially to be the hero's journey for the sake of the individuation of the individual becomes the path towards immersion in the consciousness of the all and service to that consciousness. So there you have it. Muladhara to Sahasrara, basically mapped out across the Tree of Life, relating to the work of AA and to individual transformation. I hope this has been interesting and useful in your own work and understanding of the path. And as always, I'd like to ask for your comments, suggestions, questions, anything else. Please send those to me at livingthelema@me.com. Or if you like, visit my website at livingthelema.com. Read my bio page if you'd like to learn more about my work. And please also visit the Living Thelema page on Facebook. You'll find that I'm posting updates and posting some discussions there from time to time. So thanks for listening, and I'll look forward to talking to you next time.